I don't know if you guys know about the daycare scandals that were very, very common in the 1980s. So, horribly common actually. This infested many towns. And usually what would happen is somebody who was a little on the paranoid side, or maybe a lot on the paranoid side, would send their children off to daycare. And that was a whole new thing in the 80s, right? Because women were, moving into the workforce like mad, and so they were handing over often their infants, kids below 3, say, to total strangers. And, for some of them, that set up a fair bit of worry, like it still does. And sometimes that worry got out of hand, especially among the people who are a little predisposed to paranoid schizophrenia, and maybe even had some previous episodes. And so, the kid would come home and the mother would observe, or not, something kind of peculiar about their behavior, and then she'd fantasize about maybe what that was, and then, she'd start asking the child if the child had been touched in any particular way, and, and she'd keep this up for a good length of time, and then the child would start to have nightmares, and then the child would tell the mother about what the nightmares were, and then that would freak her out, and so she'd ask even deeper questions, and soon, her children were telling her that horrible things were happening to them at daycare. And so then she'd go to the police, and they wouldn't look into her psychiatric background, and then the police would go out and they'd start to interview other children. And if they interviewed them properly, then the other children would start to produce all these stories as well. Now, how did that happen? Well, a bunch of ways. The first is, the police would ask leading questions, like, did anyone touch you? Well, of course, someone touched the kids. I mean, people touch kids. Did anybody touch you there? Well, that's not a question. That's a piece of information. The piece of information is, if someone touched me there, an adult would be very interested in that, right? So now, what's a child doing when he's answering an adult's questions? Well, the child doesn't bloody well know. What the hell do they know? They're like 3, They can hardly organize their story. If you're talking to a kid and you want to get them to give you an account of their day, you have to really guide them through the organization of their memory. And partly what they're doing when you're doing that is they're looking at you, trying to figure out if they're telling you the right things, which is what they should be doing, because what they're trying to learn to do is to tell people things in a way that they'll understand them. But that makes the child very, very responsive to the nonverbal and verbal cues of the adult. You think about how fast those little rats learn how to pick up language, It's really very fast, and no one really teaches them. They're just paying attention like mad. So you get a bunch of cops who are on a half-cocked adventure, and they think there's some serial sexual pervert in their midst, and they go interview, 15, 20 kids, and they do it a lot, and they use little dolls, and they do it a lot, and they do it a lot, and they do it a lot, and sooner or later all the kids start having nightmares, and then they start telling the cops there's all these terrible things happen, like they're taken into underground caverns and they're stripped naked and they're forced to leapfrog over each other, and you just can't believe it, what happened. You can't believe it. It's all documented in a book called Satan's Silence, which was written by a social worker and a lawyer. It's mind-boggling. The longest prison sentences in American history were handed out to a series of middle-aged women who were taking care of little kids. And the FBI even came up with a whole new criminal category: late onset female sexual offender. Well, why didn't that category exist before? It's simple. There are no late onset middle-aged female sexual offenders. That's why we didn't need the category. But once all these accusations came up, well, poof, you had to have some damn category for these poor women. Some of them were put in jail for 350 years, which seems a bit excessive, given that they're only going to last about 40. They'd get 12 consecutive life sentences. There was actually a situation where one town went so far as to start digging underneath the town to find these underground satanic lairs where all these weird ritual things were going on. And along with this was not one shred of concrete evidence. And the eventual conclusions, and this affected thousands of people, the eventual conclusions was, well, there actually isn't anybody who's, satanically torturing children in daycare centers. Now, anyways, why am I telling you this? Well, what the children were doing, you think about it, how the hell did the children come up with these weird ideas? I mean, first of all, we should note that children are not stupid. And they can also dream up the most horrible things, you know, because they have an imagination that's capable of extending itself out into the terrifying. Now, everyone knows that, because all you have to do is remember when you were a kid, and, you know, when you were hiding under the covers because there were horrible things in your dark room. You know, you can populate the darkness with monsters with no problem, and you should be able to, because there are monsters in the darkness. Even though your parents might tell you there aren't, it's like there might not be any monsters in that particular piece of darkness, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing to tell your children. But in the darkness as a whole, it's like, yeah, look the hell out. So the children aren't stupid. Now, so then the adults start to question them, and the kids are, the back of their brain, the little imaginative part is thinking, what do these people want? What do these people want? What do these people want? And so they'll throw them out a little bit of information, and the adults will perk up. They'll focus right on that piece of information. So maybe it's a cop who really hates child Satanist abductors, which, you know, is a perfectly reasonable stance. And so when the child offers any information about the existence of such a thing, well, the cop will perk up. And then the child thinks, oh, I see, well, so sort of what's going on seems to have something to do. They don't think this consciously, you know, but their imagination is working. How do I model the reality that's being presented to me? And that's when the dreams start to kick in too. Okay, so by speaking in the appropriate way, you can get all sorts of things churned up in the unconscious minds of your listeners.